All right, AMP1 students, we just got finished talking about the different types of muscle fibers. So now we're going to talk about how they're distributed within a skeletal muscle. So this picture here shows just some skeletal muscle in our body. And you can see so this is the entire skeletal muscle, and they did like a transverse section through this muscle. So we can see the fascicles. There's quite a few fascicles in there. And then they pulled one fascicle out so we could see the little skeletal muscle fibers or cells end on. And then they have this image from a microscope that shows some fibers end on. And they can tell by color. A lot of the time, if there's a lot of blood supply, like capillaries and myoglobin and mitochondria, you'll get more of the darker or red colored muscle fibers. So this is showing just one skeletal muscle in the body and how the distribution of the three different types of muscle fibers. You'll see that like every muscle we have generally has like a distribution of a kind of a mixture of all the different types of muscle fibers. So we have fast glycolytic, fast oxidative, slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, fast oxidative. So you can see all those. They labeled some of them. So there's kind of a mixture. So you should know that the different types of skeletal muscle fibers are mixed within a skeletal muscle. Now, there are certain muscles, though, that'll have like a higher percentage of some of these particular muscle fiber types. So the book gives an example of like your eye muscles and the muscles in your hands. We have to do more quick and really brief contractions with those. So a lot of times you'll see those fast glycolytic fibers, like a larger number of fast glycolytic fibers in those muscles of the body, as opposed to like the muscles that are maintaining our posture. They really just need to contract, not so much fast, but they can contract slowly, but they have to contract for longer periods of time, almost continually. So those muscles, you're going to see more this, a higher percentage or number of slow oxidative fibers distributed in those particular muscles. So all muscles have a mixture of all of them, but there's certain muscles in the body that will have a higher number of certain muscle fiber types based on what their role is in the body. All right, so that is how they're distributed. And something I always like to talk about when we talk about this distribution is that actually people, based on their genes, can have like a higher percentage of, a certain muscle fiber type in certain muscles of their body. So they have done studies and seen this in top athletes. So like ones that, are distance runners, like those marathon runners. If you look at their muscles in their legs, they generally will have a higher proportion of slow oxidative fibers, opposed to someone maybe that does a sport like soccer or something where you have like more brief periods of, intense running or activity. They will tend to have like higher percentage of like fast glycolytic fibers. So obviously, you can train, for a particular sport and improve your performance in that sport, whether it is something endurance or something more where you have brief periods of activity. But it's just interesting to note that, genetics is playing a role in that too. And one of our classes is doing their ethical thinking paper on that topic of whether we should be testing athletes for athletic genes. So genetics does play a role in our ability to be, I guess, competitive in different sports. So that's a interesting tidbit. It kind of goes along with one of the ethical thinking topics that we discussed. All right, so let's go to our objectives. So we talked about the distribution of muscle fiber types in a muscle. So they're distributed throughout our various skeletal muscles in our body, but they do, some muscles will have a higher percentage of certain muscle fiber types opposed to another muscle that has a totally different function in the body. And then the next objective we're going to talk about is the muscle twitch. And what we're going to mainly kind of focus on is muscle tension. So muscle tension, whenever our muscles contract, we've kind of talked about how they contract. So, but now we're going to talk about when they contract, they're going to pull on their connective tissue, usually tendon or aponeurosis, and that's attached to the bone. So that will cause them to be able to like pull on a body part and move it. So that's how they work, is they pull. They can't like push. They can only pull. So that muscle tension is that force that they can generate whenever they contract. So we're going to see how that muscle tension varies after a muscle fiber is stimulated to contract. So we have like a little graph that kind of shows what's going on. So I think it's on the next page. Yeah, so up here's the definition for muscle tension. So just realize muscle tension is just the force generated when the muscle is stimulated to contract. It's going to generate tension. So going to pull on something. So in this little experiment that they did, so we can do this, we can take like a muscle and we can actually, usually the nervous system in our bodies does this. We have our little motor neuron that goes up and stimulates or excites the muscle fibers. But in this case, we're going to do it with a little machine. So if we just like stimulate a skeletal muscle fiber once, just give it enough stimulus for it to elicit a contraction, stimulate a contraction. What we'll notice when it comes to muscle tension is that, so this is kind of the period where we don't have much muscle tension. And then this is the point where we stimulate it. So we send the little stimulus up there to stimulate our muscle cell or fiber. Realize there'll be a period where nothing really happens, like muscle tension doesn't change. And they call this the latent period because after we stimulate that muscle cell, then it takes a little time for that action potential to travel along the sarcolemma and down the T-tubules, and it takes a little time for the calcium channels to open and the calcium to flow out into the sarcoplasm. So there's not any muscle tension generated during that time frame. So that's what's going on in the latent period. It's just the time it takes for the action potential to make its way across the entire skeletal muscle cell and for the calcium channels to open and allow the calcium to be released. But once that calcium is released and it starts binding to the troponin, and troponin changes shape to move the tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites on actin, and then the myosin heads can bind. So once we get that cross bridging going, and we get the pivot or power stroke, then we're going to start generating muscle tension. So the muscle tension will increase greatly, dramatically here. And this is called the contraction period. So that's when we got all the cross bridge cycling going, and we're getting the shortening of our skeletal muscle fiber, and that shortening allows it to pull and produce tension on whatever part it's attached to. And then we just stimulated it once, so we don't have like a further action potential coming along the sarcolemma. So then what'll happen at one point is since we don't have that action potential running down the transverse tubules, the calcium channels will close, and any calcium that's left in the sarcoplasm will be pumped back in by active transport back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so once calcium's gone, the little cross bridges can't form because the troponin goes back to its original shape, and the tropomyosin blocks those myosin binding sites on actin. And so we don't have any more cross bridges, so then as the number of cross bridges starts to decrease, then we enter this relaxation period, so where we get less and less muscle tension until we get to none. And then at this point, if we get another stimulus, then we'll go through this same latent period, contraction period, relaxation period, as we're referring to the muscle tension that's in there. All right, so that is our single muscle twitch. So the single twitch, and then relate each event that happens in the muscle cell to the graph. So we kind of went through that, what's going on. So you kind of have to know why is there a latent period, what's going on to cause that latent period where you don't see any muscle tension. And again, that's when it's the time that's needed for the action potential to run down the sarcolemma and the T tubules and for the calcium channels to be open and calcium flow out. So those are the events in any muscle twitch. So now we're going to talk about the motor unit recruitment. So realize that if we stimulate a skeletal muscle fiber, we stimulate all of it. So like the action potential runs down every transverse tubule, all the calcium channels are open, the whole sarcoplasm is flooded with calcium. So every troponin is bound by calcium, and then every cross bridge will have the ability to form. So like every sarcomere and every myofibril of the skeletal muscle fiber will shorten. And so you get like shortening of the whole thing. So we can't, like, once it shortens, that's as much force as we can generate. But sometimes we need more force. So how we do that is, and recall, because we're talking about motor units, and I pulled this up just to remind you. So remember that a motor unit, it includes the motor neuron and then the skeletal muscle fibers that it innervates or takes a nerve impulse or action potential to. So that's what a motor unit is. So if we have a situation where we need a certain amount of force, but not a lot, then only maybe like one motor unit will be stimulating its skeletal muscle fibers. And that should generate enough force to, pick up a piece of paper or something. But if we need more force generated, then what will have to happen is we'll need more of these motor units stimulated. So that way we get more of our skeletal muscle fibers activated to contract. And then the more skeletal muscle fibers that contract within a muscle, the more force, the more pull we'll have on the connective tissues that are attached to the skeletal system, parts of the bone, and be able to move that body part or pick something up, depending on whatever we're doing. So that's what this is talking about, is motor. We call it motor unit recruitment when that happens. So if we stimulate our muscle cells, if we just stimulate a few of them, then we get just a few of them contracting and providing some muscle tension. If we stimulate all of them, we can get like the highest or maximum amount of muscle tension. So that, again, we can vary the force we need to use depending on what we want to pick up or what we want to move or something. All right. So this is kind of what I talked about earlier. They call it the all or none law. So I was saying how if you stimulate a skeletal muscle cell, you stimulate all of it. It's not like half of it or parts of it. It's the all or none law. So if you stimulate a skeletal muscle cell to contract, it will completely contract, all of it will. And if it's not a sufficient stimulus, it just won't contract. So the only way to get more force generated, we can't make a skeletal muscle cell like contract any more than it already is, then we have to recruit more of our skeletal muscle cells. So we do that with motor unit recruitment, get more motor units, sending signals to more skeletal muscle fiber cells for more power